I carried my son through cancer and a mortgage, now I'm being evicted with a suitcase and silence. Alright, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Rain tapped softly against the basement window, not rhythmic, not constant, but the hesitant kind of rain that made you think someone had changed their mind about crying. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Yellow lamplight filtered through a dusty shade, casting long shadows on the walls, where photos of long-gone holidays hung crookedly. In each frame, smiles had stiffened with time. Joy frozen in gloss, surrounded by the slow decay of neglect. Helen Carter sat at the edge of a narrow twin bed, her spine stiff, hands working through the slow ritual of folding clothes. A cardigan went first, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons, the one she wore when Derek graduated college. The fabric was thinning at the elbows now. She smoothed it flat, folded it in thirds, then gently placed it in her suitcase, which sat half open on the floor like an unfinished decision. She wasn't packing with urgency. This wasn't the scramble of a woman caught off guard. It was deliberate. Almost ceremonial. Above her, the house stirred. Footsteps moved quickly across the floorboards. Not heavy enough to be Derek. Sierra. Of course. Helen stilled, listening. Through the ceiling, her daughter-in-law's voice floated down, muffled but sharp, honed by frustration. She's still down there. We can't raise a baby like this. We need our own space. Derek's reply was lower, blurred, indecisive. Helen closed her eyes, resting her hand over her heart. The sound of that voice, not the words, but the tone, splintered something inside her. Not anger. Not even heartbreak. Something more ancient. The quiet grief of a mother who'd come to realize that her usefulness had expired. She stood slowly and reached beneath the bed, pulling out a battered shoebox she hadn't touched in years. Inside were artifacts of another life. Letters from Robert, folded neatly, still smelling faintly of pine soap and old ink. A yellowing photograph of Derek building Lego castles on the living room floor. A wrinkled drawing done in bright crayon, me, Mommy, Daddy, and our home. The son in the corner had a smiley face. She blinked hard. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the drawing back inside. Then, a sound. The soft chime of the baby monitor upstairs. More muffled voices. She won't budge, Sierra muttered. You need to handle it. A pause. Then footsteps again, slower now, heavier. The door at the top of the basement stairs creaked open. Helen didn't turn around. Helen? Derek's voice was thin, barely more than a breath. Hey. We talked. Sierra and I. With the baby coming, we think it might be time you got your own place. Just for a bit. Give us some breathing room. He didn't look at her when he said it. She knew because she finally turned, and saw the way his eyes were fixed just past her, on a spot on the wall that had been chipped since last winter. She didn't ask if it was his idea. She didn't ask how long they'd been planning it. She didn't ask why he was speaking like she was a tenant with an expired lease. Instead, she simply nodded. Okay. I'll leave by Friday. He blinked. That hurt him more than shouting ever could have. She gave him a faint smile, kind, almost merciful. And that was the most terrifying thing. He nodded and stepped back up the stairs, the door closing with a muted click. Helen sat down on the bed again. Let the silence wrap around her. Then she stood, walked to the closet, and reached for the canvas tote she hadn't touched since Robert passed. Inside was a manila folder. She opened it slowly. The house deed lay inside, crisp, clear, and bearing two names, Robert Carter and Helen Carter. Her fingers brushed over the ink like it was braille. Her name was still there. Still valid. Still legally binding. I didn't lose the house today, she whispered to no one. I lost the illusion that I ever truly had a place in their future. She sat still for a long time. Rain kept tapping at the window, like it wanted to be let in but didn't have the courage to insist. Then she reached for her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Hi," she said calmly. "Yes, I'm calling about a property matter. I'd like to speak to a lawyer." Her voice didn't shake. She reached into the box one last time, retrieved the deed, and tucked it into her purse. Her name, centered and unmissable, stared back at her like it had been waiting. I left without protest, but I never agreed to be erased. The apartment was smaller than the guest bathroom in the old house. That was Helen's first thought as she stepped inside. Her second thought was, this is what it feels like to be done with someone, quietly. She didn't say that out loud. She hadn't said much at all since Friday. The studio had one window, its view partially blocked by a rusted fire escape and a blinking neon sign that read "Wash and fold open late." A futon in the corner posed as a bed. The kitchenette smelled like vinegar and lemon. The place wasn't dirty, just temporary. Like a life someone had vacated and no one had dared to refill. Helen set down her single suitcase like it was a fragile offering. She stood in the middle of the room for a full minute before taking off her coat. No need to rush. The silence here didn't expect her to fill it. She walked to the window and opened it a crack. The breeze smelled faintly of rain and engine grease. She watched the laundromat's flickering red letters blink in and out. Wash. Pause. Fold. A metaphor she didn't care to entertain. The next morning, Helen found the landlord's office on the first floor of the building, a converted laundry room with a chipped desk and the smell of cinnamon gum. Lana was there. Short silver hair, deep crow's feet, and an expression that said she didn't have time for small talk unless it came with coffee. "I don't usually do month to month," she said, flipping through the lease without looking up. "Too many runners. But you look steady." Helen didn't smile. "You mean quiet?" Lana glanced up. "Isn't that the same thing?" "Not always," Helen replied, her voice low. "Quiet is what people call women who swallow things instead of scream." Lana paused, then gave the smallest, most approving nod Helen had seen in years. "Good answer." The first night in the new apartment, Helen unpacked nothing but her mug. It had a tiny chip on the handle and a faded blue glaze. She used to drink coffee from it during her morning porch rituals back at the house. Now, it sat lonely on a laminate countertop under fluorescent light. She poured herself instant coffee, sat cross-legged on the futon, and opened her laptop. The glow stung her eyes. Her inbox contained two things, a promotional ad for hearing aids and a reply from the real estate attorney, James Rivera. "Helen. Your name is on the deed, as we confirmed. Legally, you're entitled to half the property value, or to pursue a partition sale. I know this is personal, but from a legal standpoint, you're not just a guest in that home. You're a co-owner. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. Best. James Rivera." She read it 3 times. Then again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't reply. Not yet. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Lana stood on the other side, holding a brown paper grocery bag. "Soup," she said, holding it out. "Not the fake kind. Real stuff. Carrot ginger and something with lentils. You don't look like you've eaten anything that required chewing in days." Helen accepted it slowly, blinking. "You didn't have to." "I know," Lana cut in. "But I've got a rule. If I let ghosts into my building, I feed them once before they start rattling the pipes." Helen smiled faintly. Is that what I am? A ghost? Not yet. But you're close. You're standing still like someone waiting to be missed. Helen didn't reply. She couldn't, not without unraveling. She stepped aside to let Lana in. Lana didn't take the offer. Call me if your heater makes noises. Or if you need more soup. I don't do casseroles though. I'm not that kind of old woman. With that, she left. Helen closed the door gently, cradled the bag like a newborn, and sat back down on the futon. That night, she pulled the deed from her purse again. The paper had a strange weight to it, not just legal, but historical. Her name, in black ink, right beside Robert's. Their final act of unity, one last safeguard he left behind. She ran her fingers along the edge. You didn't just build me a home, Robert, she thought. You left me armor. Her phone buzzed on the mattress. A message from Derek. Hope you're settling in okay. Let us know when you want to see the baby. Sierra just needs some space right now. She stared at the text. Then deleted it without responding. She turned back to the laptop. Opened the email from James. Hit reply. And type. James. Go ahead. Start the process. I'm ready to sell. Helen. She paused only once before clicking send. I didn't raise a son to be spineless, but maybe I did. Helen had always believed that family was a kind of sacred debt, something you paid off not with money, but with showing up. In sickness. In joy. In silence. In struggle. You showed up. That was the rule. It was the only rule. Now she understood that not everyone signed that same unwritten contract. 3 days after she filed to begin the partition sale, she received a voicemail from Sierra. No greeting. No apology. Just 4 clipped sentences. We got your legal notice. This is incredibly unfair. We're about to have a baby, and you're threatening to take away our house? What kind of mother does that? Please reconsider. There was no please when Sierra asked her to leave. Helen didn't return the call. She took the bus to her lawyer's office the next morning, a modest building wedged between a vape shop and an abandoned pharmacy. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of cold rain and street heat, the kind of sharp city scent you only get in neighborhoods where nothing's been power washed in years. Inside, the walls were painted a warm beige, and the receptionist smiled without warmth. James Rivera, the attorney, was younger than Helen expected. Late 30s, maybe. Sharp suit, clean desk, serious eyes. But he spoke gently, like he understood that she wasn't just filing a property case, she was unraveling a history. You don't have to worry, he said, sliding the signed petition into a file folder. Legally, you're on solid ground. Emotionally, I can't speak to that. Helen nodded. You don't have to. But something in her voice cracked, just slightly. Like a drawer that doesn't close all the way. On the ride home, Helen stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought of Derek as a boy, when he'd had pneumonia and refused to sleep unless she was holding his hand. She'd stayed up 3 nights straight, just watching his chest rise and fall. He used to ask her if she'd still love him when he was taller than her. Now he couldn't even look her in the eye. That evening, her phone buzzed again. Derek. She let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said, voice tired, frayed. Can we talk? She said nothing. Let him sit in the silence for a moment. I didn't want it to come to this. Sierra's just stressed. The pregnancy's been hard. We didn't mean to push you out. You didn't push, Helen replied, voice calm. You replaced. A long pause. I didn't know what to do. That's not true, she said. You knew. You just didn't want to choose. Another pause. This one hurt deeper. I don't want to lose you, he finally said. You already lost me, she replied. You just didn't notice. She hung up before he could respond. She stood at the window again that night, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Across the street, a man in a hoodie walked a dog with one of those glowing collars. Someone upstairs was practicing violin. The city was moving on, as cities do. No one was pausing to ask if a 63-year-old woman had lost her place in the world. She thought about how easily people discard the things that raised them. Mothers. Homes. Promises. And how quickly family became just a word people used to manipulate loyalty. The next day, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find a courier holding a thick envelope. From your son's attorney, he said. Inside, a legal counterproposal. Sierra was challenging the deed. Claiming Helen's name was added under duress. Helen stared at the document, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the room blurred at the edges. Then she laughed, low and bitter. So this is how they play. Money talks, but family screams. Helen didn't eat that night. The envelope sat open on her table like it had taken the air out of the room. The paper inside, neat, expensive, aggressive, felt like betrayal wearing a silk tie. Under duress, she repeated out loud. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Ridiculous. As if Robert, the man who once held her hand during chemo appointments, who had cried into her neck when they signed the papers for the house, had forced her to become co-owner of their home. She wanted to scream. Not from rage, but from the absurdity of how fast truth can rot when money's involved. She waited 2 days. Not out of hesitation, but calculation. When she finally called Derek, she didn't use the word son. She didn't call him honey. She didn't even ask how Sierra was feeling. She got right to the point. I'm offering you a buyout. 75% of the current market value, minus my legal costs. A long pause. You're serious? I'm tired, Derek. Tired of pretending that silence is peace. You have 60 days. Either buy me out, or I proceed with the court-ordered sale. But I don't need you to agree. I need you to decide. Then she hung up. That afternoon, she met Lana in the hallway, carrying a case of LaCroix and her no-nonsense energy. You look like someone who just fired her family, Lana said without slowing down. I made an offer, Helen replied. A generous one. Lana stopped, turned. Let me guess, they're shocked you had the nerve. Helen nodded. Like I stepped out of character. Lana leaned against the wall, her expression shifting from sarcastic to something softer. People expect women like us to die quietly. Or at least fade into grateful silence. I've never been good at fading, Helen said. Good, Lana replied. Because faded women don't win lawsuits. That evening, Helen made herself a drink, the first in weeks. Just one, just enough to take the edge off. Bourbon. Neat. She sat on the futon and stared at the ceiling for a while. The cracks up there formed a pattern she was learning to live with. Around 10:30, her phone buzzed. It was Sierra. The message was simple. If you go through with this, you won't see the baby. Helen read it 3 times. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She felt cold. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of intent. And it was working. Because for the first time in weeks, Helen felt doubt, not about her rights, not about the house, but about the cost. About the future. About the tiny life she might never hold, never name, never read bedtime stories to. She opened a blank email. Typed. Deleted. Typed again. Finally, she just wrote. You do what you think is right. I will too. Then she hit send. The next morning, her lawyer called. We've received a counter. From the husband? No. Sierra hired her own counsel. Helen smiled bitterly. Of course she did. They want to settle, but only if you sign a non-disparagement clause. They're worried I'll tell people the truth? They're worried you'll tell it well. Helen stared out the window. The laundromat sign blinked like it was laughing. Tell them no deal. The only thing I'm signing is a check, after they pay me in full. That night, she took the deed out one last time. She placed it on the table. Laid the ultrasound photo Derek had given her weeks ago beside it. Two truths. Side by side. Both hers. Both heartbreaking. And then she took out a pen and wrote on the back of the ultrasound. I loved you before you were born. Even if I never get to tell you. She folded it gently, tucked it into the manila envelope with the deed, and sealed it shut. I wasn't burning bridges, just watching them collapse. The paperwork went through on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the house had entered pre-escrow. It was real now, not just an emotional fracture, but a legal process. A path with dates, signatures, and financial consequences. Helen stared at the confirmation email like it had barked at her. Partition sale initiated, notice of intent filed. The house she vacuumed every Sunday, the kitchen she'd repainted 3 times, the stairs she once mopped while cradling Derek in one arm, now a transaction. A property line dispute. By Thursday, the neighbors knew. It started with a text from Marjorie, who lived 2 houses down from Derek. Helen, what is going on? I heard from Elise that you're suing your own son? Helen didn't reply. She didn't owe Marjorie an explanation. Or Elise. Or anyone who'd stood silently when Sierra began folding Helen's life into boxes like it was clutter. But still, she felt the sting. The invisible court of suburban whispers had convened, and her name was on the docket. That evening, Derek showed up at her door. He didn't text first. He just knocked. She opened the door slowly. He looked pale, smaller somehow, like guilt was consuming him from the inside out. Can I come in? She stepped aside. He sat at the little 2-person table. The silence between them settled like dust. You've put the house on the market, he said. It wasn't a question. I gave you 60 days, she said calmly. That was generous. Sierra's not sleeping. She's stressed. She's not the only one who knows how to be stressed, Derek. He looked up at her then. Really looked at her. And for a flicker of a moment, the boy she'd raised reappeared behind his eyes. Why are you doing this? He whispered. Because I gave you a home, she said, voice cracking, and you made me feel like a squatter in it. He looked down. His hands were clenched. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to choose. But you did, she said, by not choosing me. After he left, Helen stood by the window and watched the tail lights disappear. She didn't feel triumph. Or vengeance. She felt hollow. The next day, Lana caught her in the hallway. You've got mail, she said, handing over a plain white envelope. Also, someone was sniffing around the building this morning. Tall woman. Expensive hair. Didn't ask questions. Just looked pissed. Helen took the envelope. Inside was a typed note. No return address. Stop this before you regret it. You're not the only one who can dig up the past. There was no signature. Just a thumbprint smudge on the corner. Helen held the letter in her hands. Not trembling, just still. Guess Sierra's decided to skip mediation, she murmured. That night, Helen locked every window. She pulled the blinds. She opened her old photo album and removed 3 photos, one of her and Robert at the beach, one of Derek asleep on her chest, and one of her standing in front of the house with a sold sign and a crooked smile. She placed them on the table like evidence. The next morning, she walked into a stationery shop 2 blocks down and asked for a new journal. Hardcover. Blank pages. When the cashier asked if it was a gift, she said, "Yes. For someone who'll need to know the truth one day. Love from your child doesn't always survive marriage." Helen didn't sleep that night. She sat in the single armchair by the window, wrapped in an old cardigan, staring into the darkness as if it owed her something. Her thoughts moved in loops, not rage, not grief, just a low, burning ache. She kept hearing Derek's voice in her head, the way he said, "I didn't want to choose." But choices aren't just made in words. They're made in silences, too. The anonymous letter was still on the counter. She hadn't thrown it away. Not because it frightened her, but because it confirmed something she already suspected. This wasn't about discomfort. It was about erasure. They didn't just want her out of the house. They wanted her written out of the story. In the morning, she dressed carefully, not for court, not for confrontation. For memory. A gray wool coat Robert had given her on their 20th anniversary. A pair of gold stud earrings that Derek had bought with his first paycheck. Things that reminded her she had once been adored. She caught the bus across town to a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with big trees and quiet pain. The house she arrived at was modest, but well kept. Yellow siding, white trim, a porch with potted plants. She knocked 3 times. The woman who answered was in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a face that looked like it had once been soft, but learned not to be. "Mom?" Helen said gently. Her mother stared at her like she was a stranger in the shape of someone she used to love. "Well," she said finally. "You still know where I live." They sat in the kitchen, not talking. The kettle hissed. The air was thick with old wallpaper paste and silence. "I didn't come for a fight," Helen said eventually. "Then why come at all?" her mother asked, not unkindly, just plainly. Helen looked at the table, then at her hands. "Because I need to remember how not to become you." That landed like a stone between them. Her mother sipped her tea, unfazed. "You always thought I was cold," she said. "But you never asked what I had to survive." Helen nodded slowly. "I'm asking now." For the first time in decades, they talked. Not about birthdays or recipes or grandchildren, but about abandonment, bitterness, the way women are taught to disappear in service of everyone else's comfort. They didn't cry. They didn't hug. But when Helen left, her mother followed her to the door and said, "You're not me." It wasn't quite a blessing. But it was close enough. That night, Helen returned to her apartment and found a note slipped under her door. This one was from Lana. "I was wrong about you. You're not standing still. You're building momentum. Come upstairs. I want to show you something." Helen climbed 2 flights to the top floor. Lana's apartment was bigger than hers. Filled with old books, vintage lamps, and a cat named Truman who looked like he'd judged every human on earth and found them wanting. Lana handed her a glass of wine. "I used to flip houses," she said. "Made a fortune. Lost some of it. Got smarter. Now I wait for people who know what to do with the second act." Helen raised an eyebrow. "And you think I'm one of those people?" Lana shrugged. "You're in the middle of the ugliest family war I've seen in years. But you're still composed. Still clear. That's rare." She walked over to a file box and pulled out a manila folder. "Take this." It's a rundown of distressed properties in the area. Half are garbage. One or two could turn into gold if you know where to put your hands. Helen hesitated. Why are you giving me this? Because you're about to get paid, Lana said. And I'd rather see you flip a building than spend it on pain. Helen sat on the subway home with the file in her lap. She hadn't looked inside yet. But she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not anger. Not sorrow. Curiosity. You don't scare a woman who's buried a husband. The envelope was thick, too thick for anything good. Helen knew it before she even picked it up. Legal paper had a certain weight to it, a kind of smug stiffness, like it already assumed guilt. This one had her name spelled out in full, Helen Margaret Carter. That middle name only ever showed up in courtrooms and funerals. She didn't open it immediately. She brewed coffee first. Real coffee, not the instant powder she'd been using since she moved. She needed the ritual. The heat. Something to ground her. When she finally unfolded the letter, the words made her eyes blur before she even reached the end. Respondent is accused of coercing her late husband, Robert Carter, into adding her name to the property deed under duress shortly before his death. Duress. There it was again, the weaponized version of devotion. She didn't scream. Didn't curse. She simply walked to her closet, pulled out the old photo box, and emptied it onto the floor. Wedding photos. Birthdays. Receipts. The hospital bracelet from Derek's birth. Robert's old business card from the hardware store he managed in '92. His handwritten note in the margin of a legal pad, add Helen to the deed this week. Need to call Rivera. She stared at the note. Duress. He'd written that line in July. He died in September. 2 full months in between. Time to think. Time to change his mind. Time to decide. And he had. The next day, she met James, her lawyer, in a downtown conference room with beige carpeting and water coolers that hummed like cheap violins. He adjusted his glasses, calm but clearly tense. They're making it personal now, he said. They want to put you through deposition. Sierra's lawyer is aggressive. She's pulling everything she can, tax records, old wills, even Robert's hospice timeline. Let them, Helen said. Let them look. James paused. This won't be easy. They'll question everything. Your finances. Your motives. Even your marriage. Helen stared at the conference table, the faint scratch marks from years of arguments before hers. I've already survived everything they're going to accuse me of, she said. Int. Deposition room, 3 days later. Helen sat across from Sierra's lawyer, a young man with an expensive tie and the kind of face that assumed women like her were pushovers. Mrs. Carter, he began, do you recall the emotional state your husband was in when the deed was amended? He had stage 3 lymphoma, she replied. He was tired. But he was sharp. He made decisions. This was one of them. Was there any financial strain on your household at the time? There's always financial strain when someone's dying, she said flatly. But I wasn't after his money. I already had what I needed. Which was? Helen leaned forward. A life with him. Which I got. And then lost. Just like you're trying to make me lose the rest of it. James gently touched her wrist, a signal to stay calm. The lawyer pressed again. Did you or your husband ever discuss excluding your son and his wife from future property rights? No, she said. But he also didn't assume they'd ask me to leave after he died. That shut the room up for a moment. Outside the building, Helen stood in the cold with her coat pulled tight. James joined her a few minutes later. You did well, he said. Better than I expected. They'll twist it anyway, she replied. Probably. But facts are facts. And you have more than enough of them. She nodded, then added, Sierra's not afraid I'll take the house. She's afraid I'll remind Derek who he was before he met her. Back at her apartment that evening, Helen found a small padded envelope in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single key. Attached was a sticky note in neat, blocky handwriting. One of the properties we talked about. 302B, think of it as your first audition. Lana. Helen held the key like it might melt. She didn't feel powerful. She felt alive. My husband left me more than a memory. It started with a drawer she hadn't opened in years. The kind of drawer every long marriage leaves behind, filled with old phone chargers, expired warranties, thumb drives with forgotten contents, and one key without a tag. She didn't know what made her open it that night. Maybe it was the deposition. Maybe it was Lana's mystery key still burning a hole in her coat pocket. Maybe it was just insomnia wrapped in curiosity. Whatever it was, it led her back to her past, to the cardboard box tucked behind her dresser labeled Robert, legal/old docs. She hadn't opened it since the funeral. The smell of paper and cologne hit her as soon as the flaps opened. She sifted through everything slowly, like peeling back layers of her own history, tax files, bank statements, hospital forms. Then, buried at the bottom, a sealed legal envelope stamped with the logo of Northbrook and Howell LLP. Her breath caught. The firm Robert had used when he handled his will. She slid it open with shaking fingers. Inside, folded once, was a supplemental letter, dated 10 years ago to the day. Just after his second relapse, before remission, before the last, slow goodbye. To whom it may concern. In the event of my death, this is a standing addendum to my estate plan. If my wife, Helen Margaret Carter, remains unmarried or does not permanently vacate the primary residence for a period of 10 consecutive years following my death, full ownership of the property shall revert to her name alone. This clause is to ensure her long-term security, regardless of any claims or assumptions made by third parties. Robert L. Carter. Helen read it twice. Then a third time. The weight of the paper in her hand felt different now. Not just proof. Not just legality. Validation. He had seen this coming. Not Sierra, exactly. But something. Some situation where Helen would need to be protected, not just in mourning, but in memory. And he'd left her a shield she didn't even know she had. She called James first thing in the morning. I found something, she said. A clause in Robert's estate. It names me as the sole heir to the house, but only after 10 years. James paused. When did he pass again? 9.5 years ago. A long silence. That's not nothing, he said finally. It may not block the current sale, but it'll change the negotiations. Sierra won't like this. Helen almost smiled. Good. That afternoon, she walked to 302B, the address on the key Lana had given her. It was a small duplex on a quiet, crumbling street. Half-board windows. Yellow caution tape from a long-forgotten repair. But the bones were strong. She stepped inside and coughed, dust and airlessness greeting her like an old friend. The walls were cracked. The flooring was a mess. But she could see it, the potential. She took out her phone. Snapped photos. Made notes. Measured windows. She didn't feel like a mother-in-law on the defensive anymore. She felt like a woman with options. That evening, she drafted a letter. Not for Sierra. Not for Derek. For the baby. She wrote. You don't know me yet. Maybe you never will. But your grandfather once promised me that I would always have a place in this world. And he made sure it was true, in writing. When you're old enough to understand what a home really means, ask your father how ours was built. And who was forgotten when it was time to move in. With love, always. Grandma Helen. I had to choose between legacy and leverage. Helen stood in front of the mirror for a long time that morning. She wasn't looking at her reflection, not really. She was looking through it. Past the crow's feet, past the jawline softened by time, past the cardigan she always reached for when she needed to feel untouchable. She was staring into the version of herself she never expected to become, the woman willing to walk away from her own blood to protect her place in history. The phone call came just after 11 a.m. Sierra's voice was clipped, breathless, and shaking slightly, not with fear, but with fury barely held in check. I saw the clause. Your lawyer sent the notice. Helen didn't flinch. It's real. You think this changes anything? I think it reminds you that this house didn't build itself. Sierra laughed once, cold. You're playing a dangerous game, Helen. No, she replied. I played nice for too long. You're just mad I finally joined the table. A long pause. Then Sierra said it, not as a threat this time, but as a sentence passed. You'll never see her. Not the baby. Not for a minute. If you go through with this, you're not family anymore. Helen felt her stomach twist. There it was. The cost. Not a house. Not money. But a child, a new life she would never hold, never kiss, never smell the powdery warmth of. And maybe she could turn back. Maybe she could withdraw the petition. Apologize. Accept whatever crumbs of forgiveness Sierra and Derek offered. Settle for birthdays she'd be invited to out of guilt. She didn't answer. She just hung up. That night, she sat with Lana on the stoop of 302B, a flask between them, the city quiet in that strange way it sometimes is just before something breaks. You ever feel like you're fighting for something you'll lose anyway? Helen asked. Lana took a sip. Sure. But you don't fight to win, sweetheart. You fight to not vanish. Helen stared ahead at the broken sidewalk. She said I won't see the baby. If I go through with this. And if you don't? Then I teach my granddaughter that silence is safer than self-respect. Lana passed the flask back to her. Sounds like you already know your answer. The next morning, Helen emailed James. Amend the offer. Full market value. Plus 20%. And a formal written statement relinquishing any claim to slander or contest future ownership rights. No more games. Helen. She didn't cry. She almost did. But instead, she went to 302B and stripped the wallpaper from the back bedroom. Layer by layer, like peeling off everything she'd ever swallowed to keep peace. She found initials carved in the wall beneath one layer. MJ plus CR. A love story buried under years of paint and time. She smiled. Good for them, she whispered. Then picked up the scraper and kept going. Sierra smiled in court, and it terrified me more than her threats. Courtroom was beige. Not the kind of beige you paint intentionally, but the kind that settles like dust on forgotten things. Everything in it, the carpet, the chairs, even the air, felt like it had given up trying to be anything but bland. Helen sat at the left table, beside James, her lawyer. He wore a navy suit and tapped a pen slowly against his legal pad. Calm. Prepared. Focused. Helen, by contrast, sat perfectly still. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her breath slow. She didn't want to fidget. Not today. Not here. Across the aisle, Sierra adjusted the hem of her soft gray maternity dress and whispered something into her attorney's ear. Her bump, now clearly visible, rested gently against the table edge like a silent, swelling weapon. Derek sat behind her, shoulders slumped, eyes on the floor. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. So did Helen. The judge, a tall woman with silver glasses and the patience of someone who had seen too many families eat each other alive, took her seat. "We're here for the initial hearing on the petition for partition sale and counterclaims regarding alleged coercion," she said, voice even but sharp. "Let's keep this civil." A quiet scoff from Sierra's lawyer, young, smug, and overconfident. The kind who thinks his job is to twist the knife, not prove the facts. It began. Sierra went first. Her lawyer stood and spoke with faux sadness, gesturing occasionally to the very obvious bump beside him like it was a halo she wore. "My client is 7 months pregnant, Your Honor. She and her husband are preparing for the birth of their first child in the home they believed was theirs. To be forced into financial ruin or instability at this stage is, frankly, unconscionable." Helen raised an eyebrow. Unconscionable? She'd left that house with 2 suitcases and no warning. No one called that unconscionable. The lawyer continued. Furthermore, there is reason to believe Mrs. Carter's name was added to the property deed during Mr. Carter's illness, when he may not have been of sound mind. James stood calmly. "We have documentation, dated, notarized, and witnessed, proving Robert Carter was fully competent when the deed was executed. And we have a handwritten note from Mr. Carter 2 months prior, expressing the intent to do so." Sierra's lawyer objected, asking for handwriting verification. The judge waved it off for now. "We'll revisit." Then they brought up the clause. James laid it down on the table like a trump card. The addendum in Roberts will granting Helen full ownership, effective in 6 months. Sierra paled, just slightly. But then, and this chilled Helen more than anything, she smiled. Not warmly. Not nervously. She smiled the way someone does when they realize they've rehearsed for this moment their whole life. Sierra took the stand. She spoke softly. Wore exhaustion like a well-fitted shawl. She told the judge about how strained things had become when Helen moved into the basement. About how she often felt judged. About how Helen made subtle comments about her cooking, her decorating, her parenting plans. Helen wanted to object. She wanted to shout. But she didn't. She sat still, letting it wash over her. Because that's what women like Sierra did, they made their ambition look like survival and their hostility sound like victimhood. When it was Helen's turn to speak, she stood without being asked. She looked directly at the judge. "I didn't raise a son to be spineless," she said. "But maybe I did. And I didn't marry a man to protect a property, I married a man who wanted to protect me." That clause wasn't a loophole. It was a promise. The judge nodded, slowly. She didn't smile. But she didn't look away either. After a short recess, the judge returned with her decision. "We will allow 30 days for both parties to reach a settlement before the court proceeds with forced sale proceedings." She looked at Sierra. "And if that settlement doesn't happen, the consequences fall on both sides." Helen left the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the fall air had turned sharp. The kind of cold that wakes you up. She walked 4 blocks without direction, ended up at a bakery, and bought a cherry scone she didn't eat. She just sat there. Watching people pass. Mothers with strollers. Teens on bikes. A woman her age laughing with her granddaughter. She imagined what her grandchild's laugh would sound like. And then she folded the napkin neatly and left. Sometimes silence is betrayal with better manners. Helen hadn't cried since the courthouse. Not during the walk back. Not on the bus ride home. Not even when she reached her apartment and stared at the manila folder containing every legal shred of the life she'd built. But the tears came 2 days later, at the bottom of an email thread. It had started innocently. She was looking for an old appraisal form to submit for court. She logged into Robert's archived email account, the one she'd kept access to after his death. She typed in deed as a search term. The usual came up: bank statements, property records, legal reminders. But then, tucked between two threads about hospice arrangements, was something she hadn't seen before. An email from Derek. "Hey Dad. Just checking in on the paperwork stuff. Are you sure you want to go through with adding Mom to the deed? Sierra and I talked, and we're thinking long-term, this might complicate things. Especially if we ever want to update the house later or refinance. I know it's your call. Just wanted to say it out loud. D." The date was 3 weeks before the deed was finalized. Helen blinked. "Read it again." Her throat went dry. He knew. He knew. She sat still for a full hour, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a punishment. But none came, just the realization that this wasn't Sierra's war anymore. This was Derek's cowardice. His complicity. His quiet, smiling betrayal. That evening, she pulled out an old VHS tape from a box marked Derek, Little. She hadn't watched it in years. She borrowed a portable player from Lana, who said nothing, just handed it over with a quiet nod, and plugged it in. The screen flickered to life. Derek, 7 years old, bouncing on the living room couch. "Watch this, Mom," he'd shouted. "Watch me fly." Robert laughed off-screen. Helen's voice called back playfully, "Careful, I just cleaned." A tiny boy. A world that orbited around her. She pressed pause. Let it freeze on that moment, his arms spread wide, midair. The next day, she asked to meet him. He agreed, reluctantly, and they sat on a park bench surrounded by brittle grass and empty playground swings. Helen didn't sugarcoat it. "I read the email," she said. Derek's face went pale. "I didn't mean, I was just, Sierra and I were." "You knew," she said quietly. "Before Dad passed. You knew he was adding me to the deed. You knew I was being protected. And you still let her push me out." He looked down. Picked at a corner of the bench. "I thought I was keeping the peace." Helen's voice didn't rise. "You weren't keeping the peace, Derek. You were keeping the silence. And silence is where people disappear." He finally looked at her. His eyes were red. "I didn't want to lose her." Helen nodded slowly. "And you lost me instead." She stood. For a moment, he reached for her hand, reflexively, like a boy again. But she didn't take it. That night, she sat on the floor of her apartment with a pile of photographs, not to reminisce, but to decide what was worth keeping. Half went into a box. The other half, the ones that didn't feel true anymore, she put in a drawer she didn't plan to open for a long time. You don't negotiate with fire, you contain it. Sierra showed up at Helen's apartment without calling. No warning. No text. Just a knock at the door, sharp and urgent. When Helen opened it, Sierra stood there, 7 months pregnant, sunglasses on, jaw tight, lips pinched like someone had told her not to cry and she had taken it as a life commandment. Helen said nothing. Sierra stepped inside without asking. She looked around once, at the tiny living space, the dated appliances, the single chair by the window, and offered a smile Helen recognized immediately. Pity disguised as power. "I didn't come here to fight," Sierra began, removing her sunglasses with deliberate flair. "I came because this has gotten out of hand." Helen crossed her arms, calm. "You threatened to erase me from my granddaughter's life." "I was upset," Sierra snapped, then softened. "But come on. We're talking about court battles, forced sales, dragging Derek through months of stress when he's already." He's not the one dragging him, Helen interrupted. That would be me. The woman you asked to leave her own house. Sierra hesitated. Then changed tactics. We could have worked something out. We did. I offered a buyout. You refused. There it was again, the smile. That tight, calculated curve of the lips that said I'm the calm one now. I'm here, Sierra said gently, to offer you a compromise. Helen raised an eyebrow. You walk away. No more claims. We keep the house. You get a dignity payout, small, but symbolic. Enough to start over somewhere warm. Helen laughed. Softly. Then shook her head. You think dignity is something you pay out? Sierra didn't flinch. You're not going to win, she said flatly. Even if you drag this out and sell your half, you won't see a dime until the baby's born. And by then? I'll make sure the door's closed. Helen walked to her drawer, pulled out a folder, and set it on the table. She didn't say a word. Sierra opened it. Inside, a new, signed legal offer. Formal. Uncompromising. Full market value of Helen's share. Plus 20% in damages and legal fees. Plus a signed statement waiving future contest over estate disputes or public narrative challenges. With a deadline of 10 business days. Sierra's hand tensed around the paper. You're bluffing. Helen shook her head. I've lived in silence long enough. This isn't a bluff. This is me taking off the gloves. Sierra stared at her for a long moment. Then, to Helen's surprise, she sat down. And for the first time since this began, she looked small. I never had a mother, she said, voice cracking just slightly. Mine left. I've done everything I could to build something solid with Derek. This house, it's the first safe place I've ever had. Helen sat across from her. And you think safety comes from erasing people who came before you? Sierra wiped at her face but didn't cry. I think safety comes from control. From knowing I'm not disposable. Helen stared at her. Finally, she said, then you understand exactly why I'm doing this. After Sierra left, offer in hand, mask cracked, Helen sat at her kitchen table and didn't move for 20 minutes. Not out of exhaustion. But out of certainty. She wasn't angry anymore. She was anchored. That night, she found a flyer tucked under her apartment door. Bright yellow. Bold font. It read. Retirement properties that flip your fortune, learn how to turn equity into empire. Seminar this weekend. Coffee and pastries provided. Helen stared at it. Then laughed. Long and loud. She folded it into her pocket. Maybe she'd go. I didn't want revenge, I wanted to matter. Helen didn't hear from Derek or Sierra for 8 days. No calls. No counteroffers. No legal pushback. Just silence, the kind that doesn't signal peace, but calculation. She didn't wait by the phone. She didn't check her email 10 times a day. Instead, she went to the seminar. It was held in the back of a Sheraton conference room filled with too much carpet and not enough oxygen. The coffee was burnt. The pastries were sad. But the room buzzed with a strange energy, not hope, exactly, but defiance. Everyone there wanted to rebuild something. Everyone there had lost something. Helen sat in the back, took notes, listened. Lana was beside her, nodding at the right moments, side-eyeing the sleazier parts of the presentation with dry amusement. They left with a workbook, a lead on a potential fixer-upper, and a napkin scribbled with contacts from a woman named Patrice who used to flip bungalows in Tampa before the divorce. It wasn't magic. But it was momentum. Later that night, Helen pulled out her journal, the one she started after Sierra's first threat, and flipped to a blank page. She began to write a letter. This one wasn't for lawyers. It wasn't even for Sierra. It was for the baby. Dear little one. I may never get to know your laugh. I may never smell your hair or watch you open birthday presents. But I want you to know this. Your grandmother didn't disappear. She was erased. And then, she came back. If someday you wonder where I was, or why I wasn't there, ask your father. Then ask yourself if silence always means absence. 'Cause I was here. I never left. I just refused to be small. With love you'll never be told about. Grandma Helen. She folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope marked, to be opened on your 18th birthday. Then she placed it in her fireproof safe, next to the deed copy and the will clause, the paper trail of her resistance. On the 9th day, a letter came in the mail. Thick envelope. No return address. Just a cashier's check inside. The full offer. Market value. Plus 20%. No note. No apology. Just proof. Proof that they'd accepted the terms. That they'd given up the house. That she had won, not by taking something from them, but by refusing to let them take it from her. She stared at the check for a long time. Then she walked to the kitchen. Made herself a cup of tea. Sat by the window with Truman the cat purring near her feet. And finally, for the first time in weeks, she exhaled. The next day, she and Lana met with a contractor to tour 302B. The place smelled worse than she remembered. But the light through the east window was glorious, soft and golden like forgiveness. They talked about gutting the kitchen. Rebuilding the floors. Creating an upstairs rental unit. Helen sketched ideas on the back of a takeout menu. She wasn't rebuilding the past. She was building something that had never been hers before. Sometimes closure comes with a pen, not an apology. The lawyer's office was cold, clinical, decorated with forgettable art and furniture that screamed mid-range and replaceable. Helen sat at the long walnut table with her reading glasses low on her nose, pen in hand, and a closing folder in front of her. The final paperwork. The home on Myrtle Avenue, the one she scrubbed after toddler tantrums and painted when Derek brought home his first art project, now just numbers on a ledger. James sat beside her, reviewing the fine print one last time. No revisions from their side, he said. It's all as you requested. Once you sign, it's done. She nodded. Her fingers hovered above the signature line for only a moment. Then, smoothly, clearly, she signed. No shaking. No second-guessing. Just ink. Derek arrived a few minutes later. He didn't sit. He looked older. Thinner. There were shadows beneath his eyes, the kind that no sleep, no advice, and no good intentions could fix. Hi, Mom. She met his gaze. Derek. He held out a manila envelope, not dramatic, not ceremonious. Inside, photos of the baby. A tiny girl with wisps of dark hair and curled fists. Her name's Helen, he said quietly. I didn't pick it. Sierra did. Helen's breath caught, but she said nothing. I thought maybe, you'd want to know. I did, she replied. And I do. She didn't ask to hold the pictures. She let him place them on the table. Because this wasn't about possession anymore. This was about leaving well. They stood there for a while, in the quiet, surrounded by the hum of printers and the soft scratch of pens from another room. Then she said, tell her stories about me. Not the ones Sierra tells. Tell her mine. He nodded, small, almost imperceptible. She left without a hug. But with no hatred either. Just the soft ache of a mother who had made peace with the son she no longer recognized, and still chose not to unlove. That afternoon, Helen and Lana drove back to 302B. The windows were open. The air smelled like dust and drywall. But it felt free. Helen opened the door, stepped inside, and placed the closing folder on the new kitchen counter like a trophy. "It's done," she said. Lana handed her a small bottle of champagne. "No one's going to throw you a party," she said. "So we throw our own." They popped the cork right there, with the walls still unpainted and the floor still covered in renovation debris. Helen raised her plastic cup. "To things they never saw coming." Lana clinked hers. "To the next name on the deed being only yours." "I didn't lose a home. I gained my name back." The last screw slid into place with a soft, satisfying click. Helen stepped back, wiped her palms on her jeans, and admired the custom bookshelf she'd mounted herself. The wood was dark walnut, grainy and warm. It held exactly 5 books so far, none of them were novels. They were plans. Blueprints. Guides to permits, zoning, and design. This was the life she'd never imagined, but was finally building with her own hands. The renovations at 302B had finished 2 weeks ago. And in that time, Helen had done something she hadn't done in years. She made a home. Not one inherited. Not one shared. Not one loaned to her until she became too much. Her name was the only one on the deed. There was no one to ask permission from. The living room smelled faintly of sage and new upholstery. The couch, a sleek gray sectional, sat below a single abstract painting she found at a local artist's sale. Nothing expensive. But bold. She didn't want comfort anymore. She wanted clarity. That morning, Lana had come by to drop off keys to the next place. A duplex 5 blocks over. Tired siding. Shaky porch. But a backyard with potential and a footprint that whispered, "I could be beautiful again if someone just cared enough." Helen stood in the driveway for a long time before nodding. "We'll take it," she'd said. Lana only grinned. "I already told the auctioneer." Later, back at 302B, Helen wandered from room to room, barefoot on hardwood, every floorboard now familiar. The kitchen was small, but efficient. Brass handles. White tile. A herb garden sat in a narrow windowsill, basil, mint, rosemary, all still fragile but growing. She paused at the door to the back room. What was once going to be a guest bedroom was now something else. A map of the city covered the far wall, dotted with color-coded pins, houses for sale, empty lots, potential flips. On a whiteboard, scrawled in purple marker. "Don't rebuild the past. Rebuild yourself." She didn't even remember writing it. But she kept it there. As the sun dipped, golden light filled the space. Helen poured herself a glass of red wine and sat on the back steps. Truman the cat, now fully hers, slinked past her ankles and flopped down in a sun patch on the deck. The neighborhood was alive with soft sounds, distant traffic, wind in the leaves, someone's child calling mom, from a block away. It didn't echo with guilt anymore. It just existed. And so did she. When she went inside, the mail was sitting on the table. Nothing urgent, just bills, flyers, and one small square envelope with no return address. Her hands trembled only slightly when she opened it. Inside was a photograph, a baby girl, maybe 3 months old, in a cotton pink onesie, lying on a plush blanket. She had dark hair. Round eyes. And something in the curve of her lips that looked so familiar it stopped Helen's breath. On the back, in Derek's handwriting. "Her name is Helen." That was it. No love, Derek. No apology. No olive branch. Just that name, written with such certainty it became something more. Helen didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She simply placed the photo against her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "That's enough." Then she tucked the picture inside a drawer in her new desk, next to her letter to the baby, still sealed and waiting for 18 years to pass. That night, Helen made herself a full dinner: roasted chicken, herbed rice, grilled vegetables. She lit a candle. Set the table for one. Not out of loneliness, but out of ceremony. Before bed, she walked through her house again. Each room whispered with memory, not of what had happened there, but what she'd taken back in building it. Her bedroom, the soft blue walls, the clean white linens, the lamp that cast a gold halo in the corner, didn't remind her of anyone. It just felt like hers. Above the headboard, she had framed a single quote, printed in her own handwriting. "You cannot burn a woman who has already walked through fire." Just as she turned off the light, her phone buzzed. A message from Lana. "Want to buy a block together? There's a strip of 4 townhomes going up for auction. I think we could turn them into something real. Also, I think we already are." Helen stared at the screen for a long time. Then typed back, "Let's build a story no one else gets to edit." She placed the phone down, slid into bed, and lay in the room she bought herself, not out of desperation, or survival, or compromise, but out of choice.